The avoidant person initially interprets silence as temporary respite that will eventually break when their former partner succumbs to longing or curiosity. Their psychological framework assumes that distance creates longing and that withdrawal eventually triggers pursuit, confirming their significance and maintaining their sense of control. However, when silence extends beyond their expected timeline and begins feeling permanent rather than strategic, it triggers a cascade of responses that reveal their hidden vulnerability and need for validation. Their behavior shifts dramatically as they confront the possibility that they have genuinely lost someone's interest and investment entirely. They monitor from distance with increasing desperation. The avoidant person begins obsessively tracking their former partner's life through indirect means when silence starts feeling permanent. They check profiles repeatedly, analyze activity patterns, scrutinize content for hidden meanings, and create elaborate narratives about their former partner's emotional state based on minimal information. This surveillance becomes compulsive as they search for evidence that they still occupy mental space or that their absence has created impact worth noting. They pass through old conversations, revisit shared memories, and convince themselves they detect subtle signals or indirect messages meant specifically for them. This behavior contradicts their presentation of indifference and reveals their desperate need to confirm they still matter despite the permanent feeling silence. The monitoring intensifies as their anxiety about being forgotten overwhelms their pride about appearing unbothered. They find themselves unable to stop checking despite recognizing the behavior contradicts their self-image of emotional independence. They make indirect contact attempts to test the waters. The avoidant person begins deploying subtle tactics to gauge whether reconnection remains possible without risking the vulnerability of direct communication. They might react to content, send vague messages that require no response but signal their presence, or create situations where accidental contact might naturally occur. These indirect attempts represent their internal struggle between pride, preventing direct outreach, and growing desperation to restore some form of connection. They hope these breadcrumbs will inspire their former partner to initiate conversation, allowing them to respond without appearing needy or admitting they missed the connection. Each indirect attempt carries silent plea for acknowledgement while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. When these subtle signals produce no response, their anxiety intensifies as they recognize that silence may truly be permanent and that their usual strategies of minimal effort expecting maximum response no longer function. They experience delayed emotional flooding. The avoidant person confronts catastrophic emotional overwhelm when silence begins feeling permanent and their defensive barriers finally crack under accumulated pressure. Grief, regret, and longing they successfully suppressed during the relationship suddenly surface with intensity they cannot control or contain. They find themselves unexpectedly devastated by loss they convince themselves meant little, missing someone with painful intensity that contradicts their narrative of indifference. This delayed grief arrives precisely when reconciliation seems least possible, creating cruel irony where they finally access genuine feelings after their defensive patterns have succeeded in making them irrelevant. They recognize too late the value of someone who offered patience and acceptance, remembering moments of care they dismissed and gestures of love they failed to appreciate. The emotional flooding proves particularly painful because it arrives when their former partner has clearly moved beyond caring. When their feelings have nowhere productive to go, they oscillate between reaching out and protecting pride. The avoidant person enters brutal internal warfare when silence feels permanent. Their emerging feelings create almost unbearable urges to break the silence and test whether reconnection remains possible, while their pride insists that reaching out represents weakness they cannot tolerate. They compose messages they never send, create justifications for contact that preserve their dignity, and engage in endless internal debate about whether vulnerability is worth the risk of explicit rejection.